You see a drone being lifted by a balloon. It is completely turned off. It starts to go up. 100 meters, 500 meters, 2,000 meters, 8 kilometers above the ground. And then it detaches on its own with no pilot in control. But there's a detail here that no one notices at first glance. This drone is battery powered, and the battery hasn't been used yet. Not even 1%. That's exactly where this weapon's greatest danger lies. Because with an intact battery, everything changes. This, which seems like a small detail, is becoming one of Russia's worst nightmares right now. But, after all, how is such a simple object humiliating the most expensive air defense in the world? To understand why this balloon scares Russian generals so much, you need to understand the problem that Ukraine had been trying to solve for months. In recent weeks, the roads that supply Russian troops in the occupied territories have turned into something like a trap. The highways that connect Crimea and the occupied regions to the Russian mainland have become corridors of death. Armored fuel trucks with supply convoys destroyed one after another almost at will. Ukraine would love to push this zone of destruction even deeper. Closer to Moscow, closer to the Russian logistical heart. But there was a limit, and that limit had a number. The drones that Ukraine uses for these attacks are good, very good. But every motor-powered drone has a range limit, and theirs is around 150 kilometers. Everything within that radius became a danger zone for the Russians. Everything beyond it was safe. And Ukraine was determined to erase that word. Safe. To give you an idea of the scale of this pressure, between February and April 2026, President Zelensky announced that Ukraine had quadrupled the number of medium-range attacks. Yes, it quadrupled. In 3 months. But no matter how much they increased the volume, that ceiling of 150 kilometers was still there. Unfortunately, the drone's engine doesn't negotiate. So the question that Ukrainian engineers started asking themselves was a different one. It wasn't about building a more powerful drone, it was something much more clever. What if they could transport the drone much closer to the target before even turning on the engine? And this is where the story really starts to get interesting, because the answer they found didn't come from a cutting-edge laboratory. It came from a technology the Army had already been using for other purposes. It's the kind of twist this channel loves to break down. So if in-depth war analysis is what brought you here, subscribe, because what's coming next explains everything. First, you need to know the weapon at the center of all this and the surprising name behind it. The drone is called Hornet. It's a lightweight fixed-wing aircraft with built-in artificial intelligence. And this part matters a lot because artificial intelligence allows it to find and attack the target on its own. Even when the Russians try to jam the control signal. On a battlefield saturated with electronic interference, that's almost an unfair advantage. But here's the thing that almost no one knows about the Hornet. It wasn't created by a traditional state-owned defense company. It was developed by a company founded and funded by someone you probably know from a completely different context. Eric Schmidt, the former executive chairman of Google. Yes, the man who helped build the biggest search engine on the planet now funds AI-powered war drones, and not in a discreet way. In July 2025, the agreement to supply these drones to Ukraine was personally signed with President Zelensky present. The stated goal was to produce hundreds of thousands of units, scaling up even more in 2026. The Hornet proved its worth so quickly that even the United States Army began training with it. In exercises in Lithuania, Poland, and Africa, Germany. In other words, it's not an experimental prototype. It's a weapon that's already been tested, mass-produced, and funded with Silicon Valley money. But even the best weapon in the world, with the best artificial intelligence in the world, still hit that ceiling. 150 kilometers. The answer to breaking through that ceiling wasn't in the drone. It was in a blind spot that Russia itself didn't even know it had. To understand this blind spot, you need to understand how Russian air defense works. And it works in layers organized by altitude. Down there, close to the ground, up to about 1.5 kilometers high. Machine guns and automatic cannons, effective against anything flying below. A little higher up to about 3 kilometers. Interceptor drones, increasingly used to hunt other drones. And above that? Well, that's where things change. Above 3 kilometers, Russia practically has only one option: surface-to-air missiles. Very expensive, fired from systems like the Pantsir, the Tor, the S-300, and the famous S-400. Notice what I just described. Below, cheap weapons. Way up high, extremely expensive missiles. But between one layer and the other, there's a gap. An altitude where cheap weapons can't reach, and where firing million-dollar missiles is an absurd waste. A void. Right in the middle of the most praised air defense in the world. And the obvious question becomes, what exactly could fly in that void without triggering any alarms? The answer is what you saw first. Balloon. At 8,000 meters altitude, a balloon carrying a drone has an almost invisible signature. The Hornet, with its engine off, already generates a tiny radar reflection and almost no heat. And what about the balloon then? It's just as hard to detect, if not more. It rises silently, passes through the clouds, and at a pre-programmed altitude, it releases the drone by itself. It can be triggered by altitude, by crossing a boundary on the map, or simply by a timer with no operator pressing the button. And then the Hornet does exactly what you saw. It stabilizes itself and starts gliding without using up the battery. When it finally turns on the engine near the target, it still has almost all of its charge available. That detail I mentioned at the beginning, remember? The intact battery. That's what doubles, and sometimes more than doubles, the drone's range. And there's an almost comical bonus for Russia. Taking down one of these balloons is not easy at all. It's not a party balloon that pops with a pin. Just to give you an idea, in 1991, Canada fired about 1,000 shots at a weather balloon, and it didn't come down. At 8,000 meters, even if it's punctured, the gas escapes so slowly that the balloon can take days to come down. Plenty of time for the drone to have already completed its mission. But Russia still had an ace up its sleeve. After all, it has missiles capable of reaching that altitude. All it would take was to fire. And that's exactly where the problem appeared, one that no one in Moscow could solve. Let's suppose that Russia detects the balloon and manages to aim and fires a missile to shoot it down. Technically, it works. In practice, it's a financial disaster. Because now comes the number I've been saving since the beginning of this video. A missile from a system like the S-400 costs from hundreds of thousands to several $1,000,000 per shot. But the balloon, plus the drone, plus the gas, the whole thing costs somewhere between $8,000 and $20,000. Now compare that with the other side. To try to take all that down without even a guarantee of success, Russia needs to use up a missile that costs the equivalent of a mansion. Or several. Multiply that by dozens of attacks, by hundreds, and you understand why this is unsustainable. And there's more. Russia's missile stockpile isn't infinite, and there are clear signs of wear. Open sources indicate that Russia has already lost more than 40 S-400 batteries throughout the war. And that's not all. Moscow even tried to buy back systems it had sold to Turkey and to delay deliveries already contracted with India. In some attacks, missiles with export markings even showed up. In other words, missiles that weren't even intended for Russian use. Each of these signs on its own would already say a lot. Together, they show that Russian stockpiles are really under pressure. Now, put together everything I've said so far. We have attacks that cost as much as a used car, against a defense that costs millions per shot, powered by a dwindling stockpile. That's why we say that the world's most expensive defense simply has no answer. It's not due to a lack of technology. It's because the numbers don't add up. The math is on Ukraine's side. Now, take that single balloon you saw at the beginning and multiply it by 1,000. Because that's more or less what Ukraine is putting in the air. Since the end of 2025, more than 1,000 balloons have already been launched into Russian territory for a variety of purposes. And now, with the variant that carries the Hornet, every kilometer of Russian territory that seemed safe is no longer safe. And this isn't just a theory. The Hornet is already in combat. Right now, the 1st Azov Corps of the Ukrainian National Guard has confirmed the systematic use of these drones against Russian supply routes. And the pilots say they patrol roads up to 160 kilometers behind the front line, flying over the occupied city of Donetsk, more than 50 kilometers from the front. On June 10, 2026, drones from the same corps attacked the port of Mariupol. The result was a blackout at the site. Fuel tanks, electrical substations, radar equipment, and even the control tower were hit. In a single attack, the city lost much of its capacity as a logistics center. 5 days earlier, on the 5th, it was the turn of the railway lines that supply Crimea. And on one of the main military routes to the peninsula, the so-called Novorossiya, Russian traffic plummeted. The drop reached 71%. And do you know what the accumulated effect of all this is? The worst fuel crisis in Crimea since Russia took the peninsula in 2014. And the Kremlin, which almost never admits weakness, was forced to publicly acknowledge the size of the problem. And everything you've seen so far was done with drones. And the balloons are just the next step. They're the solution to take this same Hornet even deeper, even cheaper, toward targets that Russia thought were out of reach. Look, I have to say, this story is far from over. As Ukraine ramps up production and refines the technique, it's likely we'll see these launcher balloons entering combat more and more frequently in the coming months. If you want to follow how this unfolds, subscribe to the channel. This is where we'll cover every chapter of this war, which is changing faster than any military manual can predict. But maybe the biggest lesson from this video isn't even about Ukraine or Russia. It's about an illusion. The illusion that spending more guarantees more protection. Russia spent decades and billions building a wall in the sky. And Ukraine, well, found the back door. Now, I want to know what you think. In the face of such an asymmetry, does it still make sense for a country to invest billions in gigantic defense systems? Or does the future of war belong to those who know how to do it more cheaply, more simply, and more creatively? Leave your opinion down below. I read all the comments. See you in the next video.